A friend set up my dad and he was nearly beaten to death. My grandfather got revenge on everyone involved. Background. This all went down in the late 1970s when my dad was 17. The area he grew up in the UK was a stereotypical working class town. The part of town my family lived on was run down, full of poor families and had its fair share of crime. But it was close-knit and everyone knew everyone. This will be important later. Now, my dad wasn't the most well-behaved kid, and he hated being at school. But aside from a speeding ticket, he'd never been in trouble with the police. He was, and still is, a really talented musician and had a very active social life. For his 17th birthday, one of his friends had bought him a leather jacket with a very specific logo on it. We'll call this friend Dave for future reference. According to my dad, it was a rare and quite expensive motorcycle jacket. He was extremely happy that Dave had got it for him. Dave had bought himself the same jacket a while before and it was a big surprise. My grandmother apparently joked that with the jackets on they looked like twins, and she wasn't far wrong. They had similar features, black hair, and were both well known for being kitted out in motorcycle gear. A few days after my dad's birthday, he was leaving work as a bartender in the town centre at around 10 PM. As he was getting close to where his bike was parked, a gang of 5 men approached him from behind. The last thing my dad remembers was being smacked over the head and passing out as he hit the floor. These men beat up my dad with bike chains and a crowbar, literally to within an inch of his life. Luckily, 2 bouncers from a nearby pub had heard the commotion and rushed to help. The men ran off, the bouncers called the cops, and my dad was taken to hospital. It turned out that Dave had quite a substantial gambling habit and owed a large amount of money to people who you really don't want to owe money to. They'd threatened Dave and told him that they would be looking for him to teach him a lesson. So Dave decided to set up my dad to take the beating instead of himself, or at least lessen his chances of taking it. He'd bought my dad the same jacket because these guys knew that was what he wore when he rode. He then arranged for a guy he knew to find out when my dad left work and call up the loan shark to let them know where Dave was. What a scumbag. On to the revenge. My grandfather and grandmother were obviously distraught about this whole thing. The first thought on my grandfather's mind was if my dad would survive. When that was answered, his second was how best to get his revenge. Bit of backstory on my grandfather. He was a lifelong boxer and had a career as a military man. He enlisted at the back end of World War II at 17, stayed in the forces through Korea, and then served in Malaya and Burma as a scout and sniper during the mid to late 1950s. He only reluctantly retired when my dad was little and worked as an engineer after his discharge. This guy was a certified badass, even into his 50s, and although he wasn't the best husband or father at times, he could never stand by and watch his family get hurt. The first move my grandfather made was to call up every ex-service buddy, bouncer, pub landlord etc. that he knew, and even a few less than legit characters he knew from the pubs. In my town, word travelled fast, and my grandfather was well liked and had a bit of a reputation, so it wasn't long before he had the names and addresses of the 5 men who'd attacked my dad. Apparently, these guys had been bragging about beating up a defenceless man from behind. These guys were career criminals with a violent reputation, but my grandfather really didn't give a shit about who or what they were. My grandfather then called up a few of the most dangerous, hardened guys he knew from the service. He explained to them what had happened, and they were all happy to help. One night, the group kicked in the doors of each thug and beat them to a pulp, all 5 of them. They knew that if they hit one, the others would hear about it and run, so they hit all 5 of them in one night. My grandfather knew that no one would call the police in the area they lived in. Talking to the cops was a big no-no in that area back then. So there was little chance of being caught. All 5 guys ended up bloodied with broken bones, shattered teeth, and the requirements to be fed from a tube by the end of the night. One of them had to be put into a medically induced coma. Of course, the police interviewed all of them in hospital when they sufficiently recovered, but none of them talked. Both out of fear of my grandfather and fear they would be labelled as rats, and nothing came of it. But my grandfather wasn't done there. He used his connections in the clubs and bars to start spreading rumours about why they'd been beaten up. Soon it got round that these 5 guys had f***ed up and had beaten up the wrong person. Not only that, but they bragged about it and lied to whoever they worked for about it. Not only were they physically broken, but my grandfather ruined their credibility. so that when they got out, no one, criminal or otherwise, wanted to be associated with them. Once this was all done, my grandfather turned his attention to Dave, the moment we've all been waiting for. He had specifically left Dave for last, knowing that he would shit himself, knowing that my grandfather knew what he'd done. My grandfather, however, was much more subtle in dealing with Dave, as he thought that a simple beating would be too good for him. He waited and asked around, and it turned out that Dave was not only a compulsive gambler, but also had recently turned into heavy drug addict as well. My grandfather found out who he was buying drugs from, when he would usually buy, and where. He had a buddy of his follow Dave when he went to buy his stuff, follow him to where he was living, and let my grandfather know. My grandfather then called in an anonymous tip that there was a huge drug deal going on at this address, and he thought that he heard gunshots. He got 2 of his buddies to do the same, and the police investigated. They searched the house and caught Dave red-handed with boatloads of drugs in his home, as well as counterfeit bills and a ton of other illegal stuff. Dave was charged, denied bail, and ended up pleading guilty to all the charges laid against him. My dad can never remember his exact sentence, but it was definitely heavy, at least 15 years. To add to that, Dave owed a lot of money to a lot of people, and let's just say his time in prison was made much worse by this fact. My dad never spoke to him again. His parents disowned him, his girlfriend dumped him, he struggled to get a job with his record, and when he got out, he had to move miles away as no one he knew wanted anything to do with him. My dad eventually recovered from his injuries, although you can still see various scars on his body from the beating he took. My grandfather never told anyone what he'd done until my dad asked him about it when he got really ill in the early 1990s. Dave's life was ruined, and out of the 5 who attacked my dad, 3 ended up in prison later in life, and 2 ended up dead due to crime. My grandfather passed away in the late 1990s, and although my dad and him had their issues, it could never be said he didn't look out for him when he needed it. Oh god, that was a long one. Very satisfying and much deserved revenge on all counts. I would be lying if I said I didn't think Dave deserved a good beating as well, but it cost him 15 years of his life behind bars, and he essentially had to start over. I'll sleep well at night thinking he probably got beaten up a lot due to all the money he owed. Don't kill your neighbour's dogs. My crazy, antisocial, elderly aunt lives in the mountains of West Virginia. My aunt is a mean, bitter old woman who was suspected of shooting and killing her ex-husband, but the cops could never pin it to her. Years ago, she bought a small home on some land that borders the land of another family in a small, narrow, isolated, forested mountain valley. The other family had been living there for a long time, and they just wanted to be left alone, like most people who choose to live in a remote mountain location in West Virginia. My aunt bought chickens and started to let them run around, unfenced, on her property, and the neighbours' dogs were very interested in those chickens. The chickens would roam around and go over onto the neighbour's property. One day, without warning, she killed her neighbour's dogs for killing one of her chickens, and only one of the dogs was killed on her property. The other one was shot dead in the neighbour's front yard. The neighbours had small kids and they loved those dogs. My aunt walked over with a shotgun and told the neighbours that they'd better never get another chicken-killing dog again, or else she would have to kill them too. The neighbours didn't take too kindly to her killing their dogs, and her actions with the shotgun, waving it around and threatening them, was over the top. But they didn't call the cops, knowing that my crazy aunt, who had a reputation for being violent, was unlikely to be arrested, and if she was arrested, she would just quickly be released from jail and be back. A couple of weeks later, when my aunt went into town, her home's back window was broken, and a bottle of burning oil and gas was thrown into her home. By the time the fire department finally arrived, the home was a complete loss, and every dog and possibly ex-husband killing shotgun and firearm my aunt owned, along with all her otherworldly possessions, were incinerated. The home was a total loss, along with the chicken coop. The neighbours didn't see anything, and the sheriff's department couldn't prove anything. My aunt had a long list of enemies. She didn't work and was too poor and lazy to have homeowner insurance. So she had to move, and her son eventually bought her a cheap, run-down trailer in town. Those of us who knew my aunt figured she got what she deserved. Moral of the story, don't screw with a mountain man's dog. Burning down the house of a nightmare neighbour is most people's dream. But is it really enough justice for someone who can consciously shoot 2 dogs to death? Yeah, they killed some of her chickens, which she obviously was pretty careless about, but they're animals just acting on instinct. How can someone be so heartless? The next post is called Why We Don't See Uncle Mark Anymore. I haven't read it yet and it seems pretty long, but there's a TLDR and it gets me pretty excited to read it, so buckle up. This was told to me by my dad over a drink recently. He'd gotten a little drunk and ended up admitting it to me, said it's been too long now and he'd paid the consequences, so there was nothing to come back on him, which is the only reason I'm posting this. So, Uncle Mark was my favourite uncle when I was a child. He always invited me round to show me his airsoft gun collection. We'd play hide and seek with my friends and he'd even take us to the beach. He would always come with sweets for us and acted like one of us, another child who just wanted to have fun. But then, when I was 7 years old, there was a day that I was meant to be going round his because we were going for a ride to this amazing place. My dad was happy and cheerful for the entire day. He was going on about how much he loved the fact his brother wanted to be in his children's life. Until he got a call. I was in my room, packing my stuff, when I heard the most blood-curdling scream from my dad. He was screaming and raging. I heard him rip open our front door and slam it back shut with enough force to make the picture next to it fall off of the wall. I didn't see my dad for a long time after that, and he never told me why until we had this talk, but that shall be explained at the end. Mum had some money saved up from a minor lotto win, so we were okay, and she always smiled and said, "Daddy is just away for a bit because he was looking after me and my siblings." Yeah, I don't know how that makes sense. Uncle Mark didn't come round either during this time, but we did see him in town a couple times. Funnily enough, he ran away the moment my mum saw me waving at him. 9 months later, my dad came home and I excitedly ran and hugged him. We had a party to celebrate him coming home. We had party food and cake and all the usual stuff. I was just happy my dad was home though. A week or so later, Dad sat me down with the other children and explained that Uncle Mark wouldn't be coming around anymore. When we asked why, he just said Uncle Mark was a bad person, and that if he ever tried to talk to us, we were to ignore him and come find one of them. We all agreed because my dad always knew best after all. One day, a year or so later, 9 at this point, I'm coming out of school to wait for my parents to pick me up. My other siblings were either at secondary school or too young for school, so it was just me. I see Uncle Mark stood there with a big grin. I get nervous when he comes up to me, saying he's here to take me for a ride. I tell him I'm not supposed to talk to him, that he's a bad person like my dad said. Uncle Mark had this scary look on his face for a second. Then he told me it was all good and his parents had changed their mind and he took my hand. That's when I saw my dad just appear. My dad punched Uncle Mark right in the face and little old me saw blood fly as Uncle Mark went sprawling. I didn't see much after that except Uncle Mark running away with my dad chasing him. My dad came back after a little while, sighed and took me in a hug. He told my mum to take me home and that he'd see us later. I don't know why, but I knew there and then it would be a long time before I ever saw my dad again. And I was right. 5 years later. 5 years my dad was gone. My mum eventually admitted to us that he was in prison for protecting us, and we all guessed it had something to do with Uncle Mark. And it had. Turns out Uncle Mark liked kids. He liked them a lot. And the day I was meant to go to his house, my aunt, Uncle Mark's wife, had called my dad and told him she'd found some pictures under her and Mark's bed of children, and she was scared of what to do because Mark was a big man. And it was later revealed he abused her, so she was scared to call the police on him. And at this point my dad had gone into a rage and stormed over to his house. He'd smashed in the door to find Uncle Mark screaming at my aunt as she waved the pictures around in hysterics. My dad had beaten Uncle Mark to within an inch of his life, and Uncle Mark was screaming that he'd make my dad pay as my dad was arrested. The messed up thing was, by the time my dad had explained why he'd done it, Mark managed to get the pictures, burned them, and scarred his wife into saying nothing, so there was no evidence. My dad was sent down for assault, but made sure my other uncles and older cousins were around to protect us in case Mark came back. But oh no, Mark waited until my dad thought we were safe. And then, according to my dad, he'd come to kidnap me from school right under their noses. Who would stop him? People didn't believe my dad when he explained Mark was a predator. They thought he was just excusing himself for attacking him. After all, the police hadn't found anything, and his wife said my dad was a liar. whereas my dad was the big angry guy with a few assaults already under his belt. So all they saw was my nice uncle here to pick me up. So after the incident at the school, he had gotten away. My dad tripped and it gave him a chance to run, but my dad knew where he would go. He knew Uncle Mark would run home to hide and more likely destroy any evidence he'd gotten since destroying the last lot. He also knew the police would be on his tail for the attack at the school, so he didn't have long. Difference was though, my dad had his car while Uncle Mark was on foot. So he drove over and demanded to know if my aunt was going to lie again, after what Uncle Mark had just tried to pull. Now, I don't like my aunt much after what she did the first time, but I think in that moment she really realised what a monster her husband was. He was willing to do this to her nephew just for pathetic revenge for being called out as a predator. She said she wouldn't stop my dad or save Mark this time. My dad ordered her to get all the evidence she could as she waited for Mark to appear. She came back down with pictures. Lots of pictures. He then told her to go, wait 1 hour, and then call the police. He was ending this. And as Uncle Mark appeared, my dad, who'd been waiting behind the wall of his garden, slammed him through the door of his house. He then proceeded to beat him to death in his doorway. He apparently, towards the end, couldn't see the floor through the blood. My dad was arrested for murder, and did so without resistance, only saying he wished they'd done his job for him. When it was revealed that Uncle Mark was indeed a predator who had attempted to kidnap me, and the fact they had to face the fact they allowed a predator to run free, he was instead charged for manslaughter, his lawyer stating my father had gone into a protective rage and had only intended to render him harmless. Funnily enough, no one argued in defence of the predator for my dad getting the murder charges. He said he didn't regret it, but he wished he'd done something else purely so that he didn't miss out on so much of my life. I told him I was forever going to be proud of him for that, and that I loved him. I was a bit shocked as to why I wasn't told the truth about Uncle Mark for so long, but my dad asked if it would have made me feel any better to have heard the truth as a child, and he was right. As a child, I definitely wouldn't have been able to mentally handle it. Yeah, while I'm sure it felt like you really wanted to kill him for such a long time, it's almost a mercy. Now that the truth was out, he would have been buggered for years in prison, then stigmatised for the rest of his life. You kind of saved him from a miserable existence, but he definitely deserved what you dealt him. I just hope he was in a hell of a lot of pain before he died. That was a great story, by the way. I really enjoyed that. And now here we are, the end of the episode. You few people listening to this are some of the greats. If you enjoy these Nuclear Revenge episodes, make sure you like this and leave a comment. I'll definitely do more. Also, if you want to see my previous Nuclear Revenge episode, it should be on screen about now. Thank you very much for listening, and remember, revenge is a dish best served to a sexual predator.